I'm begging everybody, please don't take the bait. Do not fall for the okie doke. Do not take the bait.
Tell him I'm a winner, yeah. Not pop down, not Joe, not turn in a sinner. Oh, man, still a believer. Even if we get knocked down, we keep the bounce. Now see me front, you got me from a little and a grow. Come on, a winner, yeah. Still a believer.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to the BK Talks podcast with your boy Sports Head BK. And before I get into the actual topic and address that little soundbite that I recorded at the beginning, I do want to give a little brief background. So the BK Talks podcast is something that originally came about in late 2018, 2019. I originally recorded some stuff, put that on YouTube. You're not going to find those episodes because I pulled them down to make room for my gaming channel that I'm going to talk about at some point. But then, like in 2021, I brought back the idea, putting episodes on Spotify that you can find. So the BK Talks podcast does have a little bit of a history. It kind of went on a hiatus due to me running into podcaster's block and not really running into a bunch of topics that I wanted to talk about. So I left a lot of drafts in the stash that will probably never see the light of day. But I did a full episode talking about that and talking about the reintroduction of this podcast in the episode called The Reintroduction. You can check that out. So without going into too much detail on that, if you want to hear a more in-depth story about the background, how it came about, check out the reintroduction episode. But now we're going to focus on the subject matter of this particular episode. In the wake of the Paige Beckers national championship win with the UCONN Huskies a couple of days ago, you're going to have people who want to draw you into these arguments about whether or not Paige Beckers is better than Caitlin Clark. And I'm here to tell you, it don't make no sense to do it. Don't listen to them, especially for the Caitlin Clark fans, because I know a lot of her fans can be extremely defensive of where she stands in the game and her place in the game. Don't take the bait. And I'm saying this as somebody who's not one of those Caitlin Clark super fans. I'm not one of the type of people who feel like she invented the game and that she's like the single greatest player of all time in year one. I feel like she's on track to be one of those greats and possibly break a bunch of records that have been long standing. But I'm not one of these guys who just drape themselves in the CC22 orbit like that. I'm just a person who likes sports, who appreciates really good players. And I'm a Liberty fan, so I'm rooting for the Liberty to go back to back. So I got to put that out there. Now, with that being said, Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark have kind of always been linked in some fashion because along with Angel Reese, I think Cameron Brink, and there's like a fifth player that eludes me right now. They were all top. I think it might have been the Brazilian center who went to South Carolina, Camila Cardoso, who's now playing in Chicago with Angel Reese. So I think it was like those players were the top 5 2020 recruits in women's basketball. I think no matter what service you were looking at, those players were top 5 in some respects, with Paige Beckers being like the consensus number one overall player coming out of the state of Minnesota. And Paige Beckers had like a dynamite freshman year, so did Caitlin Clark. And so people looked at that recruiting class and people who were in the know, because I'm not going to pretend to be back in 2020 one of those people who were like following women's basketball to the degree that I follow it right now. But people in the know at the time were probably projecting forward that Paige Beckers, playing on those UConn squads, was going to get like 1 or 2 national championships, despite how competitive the field is now compared to maybe UConn teams of the past. People were projecting forward maybe her being the number 1 overall pick in last year's WNBA draft. But a little funny thing happened on the way to the future, and that's Paige Beckers kind of had like this injury bug. The UConn teams themselves had some injury issues to key players that prevented them from really going straight to the top. They were always kind of close. But then you also had this girl from the Midwest, from the state of Iowa, Caitlin Clark, kind of explode. Like she came out the shoot, burying deep threes and putting up big games. But women's basketball is still kind of this niche thing. So the seasons, you started to see that stuff change a little bit more in terms of the national media. I would say like during the 2023 tournament, because I think that's when maybe the people who don't even really watch women's basketball might pay attention to the tournament. Like even the same thing with men's basketball, where you might not watch the regular season, but that tournament comes around, you're going to pay a little more attention to it. And during that time, she was just bodying teams, putting up big 40 balls and just going crazy with these deep shots that drew Sports Center attention. Then you had like some of the little showmanship with the "you can't see me" to her, I think her strength and conditioning coach, the waving off of Raven Johnson when she was out there by the 3-point line. That kind of stuff is like flashy, like stuff that a lot of maybe people who aren't that familiar with women's basketball may not think happens. Like they might not know that that's how some of these players, with more attention like that, you get more people invested. So I think even before the national championship game that I think really blew things to another level, she was already getting some pretty good attention, like selling out arenas. I think Iowa has a pretty strong fan base, and I don't think I think it's even predates Caitlin Clark. I think just that fan base is just really high on Iowa Hawkeyes women's basketball. But yeah, she was getting pretty good TV ratings and attention even before the 2023 national championship game. But once she got to that 2023 national championship game, and we got down to the closing moments of that national championship game, we had this viral moment that everyone seemed to have an opinion on, even if they ain't watch a minute of any of them games. That became like the flashpoint for what we kind of see right now. Because race is kind of one of the easiest things you can weaponize, just in general, but like especially in sports, like with the boxing over the years, you could pit the black fighter against the white fighter, and you instantly have fan bases interested in that and invested in who wins and who loses. People drew the comparison between Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. People don't want to admit it, but race is still something that is kind of at the forefront in American society, where black people, on the whole, I would say, we tend to want to see our people do well, and we support them, especially in areas where we feel like we might not be represented or promoted as much. We definitely try to go out of our way to promote that and support them. And I guess for some white people, especially in the world of sports, where maybe they don't feel like they're represented as much. That's a weird dynamic and a weird thing to say, right? Especially in women's basketball, where they had plenty of white stars, but they might be looking at, some fans might be looking at a girl like Caitlin Clark as their person that they can identify with, someone that they can aspire to be, and someone that they can support. So when you have this kind of racial dynamic in that national championship game, and you have the taunt, which is something that in sports historically, especially when black athletes do it, it draws this visceral reaction. And then you see why we had the Barstool Sports types, the Clay Travis types, the Jason Whitlock types, and a lot of the fans who call into these radio stations, and you know who you are. You see why you get people polarized that way and want to label Angel Reese like a thug or classless based on that gesture. They'll call her a thug without any evidence of a criminal record or any kind of shady past or anything like that. But the fact that she's black and doing something that they don't like to someone who is white and perceived as helpless is what is enough for some of these fans to kind of rally behind them. And in my episode back in April 2023, I talked about this and said, man, people are just stupid, because I'm looking at this whole thing and saying, yo, this is sports. This is sports at its purest form, where people are hyper competitive. People are not given any quarter. People are not going to, tamper down their personalities. People are just caught up in the moment. And it's something that Traditionally, white athletes were able to get away with doing certain things that black athletes aren't, or they'll be perceived one way or certain gestures will be perceived one way when an athlete that's white does it, as compared to when a black athlete does it. And now when it comes to the women's sports, you probably got some dudes out there who feel like they gotta be overly protective of the players, when these women are out there trying to ball and they're not crying about any of this stuff. They're just as competitive as their male counterparts. And in some cases, in the modern era, where people complain about the men not having that killer instinct against each other, they might be more competitive. So I looked at that situation and I was kind of like, man, people are just blowing this thing out of proportion. Just enjoy the game and enjoy the fact that you're getting a little spice, getting a little extra sauce in a game. And a real sports fan will look at that and say, man, I can't wait till next year, and I hope that these two teams run into each other again, just to see the rematch. And they ended up doing that with Caitlin Clark's team going ahead and knocking out LSU on the way to the national championship game, in which they fell to the South Carolina Gamecocks. But these are the kind of narratives. Those are the kind of narratives I can get behind, like the sports rivalry type stuff. But all the extra stuff, I'm not really with it. And we saw people from that moment kind of divide themselves along these lines, where you're going to be supporting Caitlin Clark, or you're going to be supporting anybody but Caitlin Clark, and that includes Angel Reese, that ended up becoming like Juju Watkins, because people started talking about how she was up next and she was going to break the records of Caitlin Clark. Then when Paige Beckers came back for her 5th season, people started talking about how, well, in the 2020 class, she was the best player in it, and that she would be better than Caitlin Clark because she's going to win a championship, and that in order to be a great player, you have to win a championship, which is something that was kind of reinforced by that segment on ESPN a couple of weeks ago during the early stages. I think it might have been the Sweet 16 when they dropped that video, where they were trying to rank the top 5 collegiate basketball players, and the common thing was championships, national championships. And they did it in a way that, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think typically that was like the barometer for how great a collegiate player is, because I think that it was understood that not everybody's going to win a championship on the college level. I mean, it's been a big narrative in pro sports for a while, and I think that narrative is kind of silly too, because you got a whole bunch of Hall of Fame players who never even sniffed the championship, let alone win one. And I think in women's basketball too, where the game was so top heavy for a while, it's kind of tough to just make that the automatic barometer, because then you'd have a bunch of USC teams, I guess, from the 80s, and UConn teams from like the 90s time period, and then of late you had the South Carolina teams. I left out Tennessee and Stanford, but those are the programs, like, for the longest time, that you could reliably count on to at least get deep into the tournament and have a legitimate chance to win. And some of those teams won multiple championships. I think all of those teams that I referenced won multiple championships. I gotta probably double check that, but it just felt like an unfair standard to try to hold someone to, especially since I don't believe that's typically the way that we've discussed women's college basketball. And maybe I'm wrong, because again, I come into that with a level of ignorance, but it just feels unfair and feels forced as a pushback against some of the excessive praise of Caitlin Clark. And I'm using that term because whenever something gets hyped, or maybe overhyped in the eyes of some, there's going to be this natural desire to bring it down a peg, or to knock back or push back against it. And I think the fact that Caitlin Clark didn't win a championship was like the easiest one. Now, if she had won one championship, I think some people might have said, well, you need to have 2 championships in order to do it. And I think that's unfair. While acknowledging and recognizing that Paige Beckers did get this championship, you also have to acknowledge the fact that she played on significantly stronger teams, you would say, like teams that had more highly touted and more sought after players than Caitlin Clark did. And that's not like making like a value judgment or not, because Caitlin Clark did have an opportunity to go to another powerhouse school because she was that good. You're a top 5 player in the country. You can pretty much go anywhere. Maybe not UConn, because if they recruited someone at your position that is ranked higher than you, maybe you don't go there. But she could have gone in theory to any other powerhouse in the country and had a better chance at winning a championship. But her desire was to stay close to home and try to do something special with her home state school, and that's what she ended up doing. She ended up being a National Player of the Year multiple times, making these big runs in the tournament with a team that I'm not going to do what some people do and say it's a bunch of nobodies, because they're good players. They might not be pro level WNBA players, but it's so hard to even get into the WNBA in the first place. You got draft picks that don't even make rosters, but she took those teams to the national championship game, knocking off strong teams on the way, and she just fell short in the championship game the 2 times that she went. But I still feel like that's an accomplishment that should be lauded, an accomplishment that you have to give credit to, because if you ignore that, then you're not being fair. I feel like you're purposely not giving her credit when it's due. Now, for the people who want to push back against Paige Bueckers, I feel like they're not being fair either, because I feel like there's a legitimate praise to come from Paige Bueckers and some of the things that she's accomplished in her collegiate career. Because a talented offensive player or talented, well-rounded player like Paige Bueckers could have easily gone to a lesser-known school and just gotten all the shots and probably averaged 25, 26 points a game, maybe even 30, depending on where she went. Maybe never win anything, and perhaps I think she's that talented to where if she was healthy, could pull a team through a deep run in the tournament. But I think it says a lot to go to a team where you have a lot of other talent and still stand out amongst that talent. That's why I try to give credit to Breanna Stewart. And it's kind of hard for me to say all these positive things about UConn, because I'm not a UConn fan. I don't like UConn as a St. John's men's basketball fan. I don't like UConn, and that hatred of UConn carries over to their women's program too. So it's kind of tough. But I still think you get some credit, even though if you're playing on what people consider to be quote unquote stacked teams. If you are like the alpha amongst alphas, I think that says a lot. Not to really get too sidetracked with Breanna Stewart, because she's also brought up in these discussions when it comes to Caitlin Clark with the greatest of all time stuff, because people like to say, well, she played on the equivalent of the 1960 Celtics. And I'll say that with that freshman year performance, I think that kind of solidifies her as being one of the greats. Like to walk in on a campus at a high pressure school like UConn and then dominate in the tournament the way you did in your first year, you give credit to Melo for what he did in his 1 year at Syracuse. You got to give props to Breanna Stewart playing the way she did during the NCAA tournament and during her freshman year, and basically feeling like, I guess, the captain of a team that you just joined and you're at UConn. That says a lot. So I don't feel like you can hold those things against her. And then she did play on loaded teams, yes, a lot of talent. That's why they were able to win all the time. Something that probably won't be duplicated. Just win every year that you're on campus, go undefeated a bunch of times. Go on this long undefeated streak, but I got sidetracked. But back to Paige. It's an accomplishment, I think, for her to do what she did, being unselfish in moments where she could have easily tried to just, prove herself, prove her worth. And just try to win, because I think that's her ultimate goal. She does the little things. She plays efficiently. She plays defense. She needs to be more durable, and I'm hoping that she does what Caitlin Clark did during her jump between year 1 and now year 2 of the WNBA season, and that's really mass up, put on some muscle, become more of a physical presence, because you're going to need that banging around with these adults in the WNBA, and you don't want injuries to derail what could be another Hall of Fame career. And I do not look forward to all of this discussion next season. Well, next month when the season starts, because everybody's going to track the stats from Paige Becker's rookie season and compare those to Caitlin Clark's rookie season, even though they're playing on two entirely different teams with maybe two entirely different roles. Arike Agubawale is an offensive force unto herself that Paige Beckers is going to be playing alongside. And then that Dallas Wings team also signed a bunch of players. Some of those players might want some shots too. So don't expect Paige to just come in, play with those guys, and then just automatically drop a bunch of points. She might have to facilitate for some of these people early on, and then get hers when she can. So just don't do the comparison thing. She's a rookie in this class. She's not a rookie in last class, and it's gonna be hard to try to replicate the Caitlin Clark rookie season. It's just not something that you can reasonably expect a bunch of players to do. But now, with that said, let me just try to address one more thing before I close out this episode. So basically, everyone's in this rush to try to compare Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark. And I know it's something that we do in men's sports. We do this generally speaking. But I feel like we're trying to force some of these arguments and force some of these debates, because for me, it's pretty obvious that race is a factor because it's easy to weaponize that, as I mentioned before. But I don't feel like it's the only ingredient in this thing as to why, one white player is promoted compared to another white player. I feel like it's one of the factors. Like if Caitlin Clark was a boring white player, no one's caring beyond that moment. Like if she was a bum, if she was a bozo, like I'm trying to think of someone who just not like the male equivalent of somebody who's just maybe the end of the bench type player, then you're not getting this kind of attention. You're not getting endorsements based on the controversy. You're not getting your game is put on national television just purely on the controversy if you don't have the goods. So I feel like people lose sight of the fact that, hey, this person just has this magnetism to them that attracts people and draws them in addition to the controversy. So I feel like on either side of this debate, they try to discount certain things to make their argument more palatable. Like the people who try to act like Caitlin Clark isn't that good, and only because of Angel Reese she got popular. I feel like Caitlin Clark is that good, and because it's so easy to draw people in off of controversy, more people descended on the game and had their hot takes, and they were able to invest in someone who's already good. Because if she was a bum, as I mentioned before, no one would care. No one would watch. No one would buy tickets. And it comes down to that. Now, Paige Beckers, she doesn't have she can hit threes, obviously. She plays great defense. She's very efficient. But if you don't have that extra ingredient, then you're basically like kind of Tim Duncan-esque, where you're great. And for the hardcore basketball fans, we know you great. But for the mass media and the audiences all around the country, they're not just watching to see a great player be great, especially in college when you're going to be great on a great team that that people even within the sport don't really support, because you're like the big bad wolf. You're like the Patriots. Ain't nobody rooting for you to do well. Like Tom Brady kind of saw both sides of this thing. When he was the underdog 6th round draft pick who got to play due to an injury, it's easy to support him and rally when he's playing against the greatest show on turf. But when he starts winning championships and he's the guy, I guess when the rabbit gets the gun, you're no longer a fan of the rabbit. You ain't rooting for him like that no more. So that's pretty much it, man. I'm always pretty terrible with the outro segments, but being that this is kind of a first in a while, where this is going to be a podcast episode that gets back onto YouTube where you're able to add feedback, I'm going to ask you to just share your thoughts on this situation. I'm going to try to come back with more topics in the realm of sports, specifically on this page, but I do got to do a couple of plugs. First one being my gaming channel, Games with BK. That's GAMZ with BK. BK like the shorthand for Brooklyn. Everybody knows that. And then also want to plug an IG art page. You might have seen the little YouTube shorts pop up if you follow me with basically these little ads for Crave the Art. But check out Crave the Art. And that's KraveDAArt, Crave the Art. A self-taught pencil artist, very talented. Go check out their page. And till the next time, thanks for listening.
The world it a turn, so me know that the sun a go rise again one day. I go reach higher heights, even if now it feels like I'm falling. All of me goodness and glory abide by my side, yeah. Knock it, come me knock we till the work done. Win or lose a man a winner, and that's for certain. Never take no program, come me and me own dance. So me go and shut and shut and shut. Tell them I'm a winner, yeah. Nap up down a Jonah, turn in a sinner. Oh, man still a believer. Even if we get a gun, we keep the bounce. I see me from, Jah got me from a little and I grow. Come on a winner, yeah. Still a believer. Tell them I'm a winner.